Hey, welcome to Soul Dialogue, where every conversation leads to transformation. Today, we are going to talk about stewarding your soul. Have you ever been living your life and you do something and you say to yourself, now, why did I do that? Or someone said something to you and it triggered you and you popped off it. And after it was over with and you calmed down, you said, now, where did that come from? I don't talk like that. I don't speak like that. I don't talk to my family or my children. Like, where did that come from? Or have you ever been in a position where you were sitting and you weren't really doing anything to trigger any emotions, but all of a sudden a feeling overcame you and you said, where did that come from? That thought, that behavior, and that feeling all lives in your soul, because your soul is that invisible part of you that will live in eternity. For a very, very long time in my life, I did not know what my soul was. I was born and raised in church. I was what you call a drug baby. I was drugged to church on Sundays all day. I was at Tuesday Bible class. I was at Friday night Tarian service. And sometimes it would turn into all night prayer meeting. To Saturday, we were there praying. Then we would have choir rehearsal that Saturday afternoon. Then we went home and freshened up and went to bed and woke up that Sunday morning and did it all over again. So I've lived my entire life in church. But living my entire life in church did not mean I knew what my soul was. And for many years, I did not know what my soul was. I lived my life making so many wrong decisions. I lived my life feeling afraid and living in fear. I lived my life very intimidated, very timid, very quiet, having no confidence in myself. I lived my life that way for about maybe 38 years of my life, as far back as I can remember. And I had no idea why I felt the way I felt. I thought the way I thought. And I behaved and made decisions the way I did. But I came to a point in my life where accumulation of those bad decisions and many, many years of living in fear and feeling intimidated and having no confidence and no vacant esteem, meaning I had no value in my own self-worth. Living so many years and coming to the point where I said something had to change. And I got to the place where I was serious about discovering why I was the way that I was. Because for many years, I just decided, I'm just going to live my life for my kids. And hey, it just is what it is for me. But I came to a point where I couldn't live that way anymore. So I began to discover why I was the way that I was and who I was and why I was created. And in that process, what that meant or what that looked like for me was becoming self-aware. And when you become self-aware, or when you begin to be brutally honest with yourself, very transparent with yourself, when you're self-aware, that's a sacredness, right? That's a sacred space where you live in truth, right? When you take a real look at yourself and you think about the choices and the decisions that you've made that shaped your life, right? When you think about the many emotions that drove you to make those decisions, right? When you think about the thoughts that were connected to those emotions that drove you to make those decisions, right? That's the purpose of your soul. Your soul is there all to work in conjunction because your thoughts turn into words and your words turn into feelings or emotions. And those emotions drive you to behave in the manner of those thoughts, right? Because I know we've all heard it. Watch your thoughts because they turn into words. Watch your words because they turn into action, right? And those actions turn into your reality, right? That's your soul. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about stewarding your soul, right? Because when you steward your soul, it's an intentional care to cultivate your inner life. And again, your inner life is your soul, right? Your inner life is that part of you that makes the decisions before you even act it out or before you even behave in that way, right? All of those things are taking place, in millimeters of seconds within your soul. But those thoughts, those emotions, and your will, that behavior all have a root. They all have a beginning. They didn't just get there on their own. They have a root and they had a beginning. And that's where I had to start. Somebody asked me, what does that look like on the ground to be self-aware? What does that look like to be brutally honest with yourself? Like, how do you even start that? Right? And that started for me because my life hit rock bottom, right? I had just gotten to the place in my life where I had just become content. And I said out loud, and I've said it to several people, look, I'm just going to live my life for my kids. At this point, I don't care, right? It is what it is. I had made so many bad decisions. But I got to the point in my life where I began to have a real relationship with God for myself, right? And I understood God so much to the point at that point in my life where I understood that, maybe being in the will of God is the best place for me, right? I had gotten to the place where I had the job that I wanted. And I said, Lord, I think I'm going to retire from this job. I was working for CPS at the time, and I really enjoyed my job and the role that I had at CPS. I really enjoyed it. And CPS was one of them jobs. You know how we are. We get them government jobs, we get them state jobs, and we just like, you know what? I'm going to retire from here and I'm going to get them good benefits. Well, that's what I said out of my mouth. I said, Lord, I love my job. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to retire. But at the same time, I was praying for God to have for God's will to be done in my life. Right? I had gotten to the point where I was just like, okay, God, I'm going to live my life the way that you want me to. And I began to pray every day, Lord, your will is what I want for my life. No matter what comes, no matter what goes, I want to be in your will, Father, because pleasing you is what's most important for me. When you see me, I want to make you happy. I want you to smile. I want you to be happy with my life. I began to pray that prayer every day. I started off my work day at work with that prayer every day. And so then my life began to go in this path where I got laid off from my job and everything began to turn topsy-turvy. Everything began to go bad. And all the while while my life was going in this horrible direction, I still was praying for the will of God for my life, right? I didn't like it. It didn't feel good. I began to lose everything, but I was still praying the will of God for my life because I didn't quite understand, right? What I didn't understand is that I began to be in the dealings of God. God began to deal with me about myself and about my life and about, everything that was going on around me. And so I began to be in the dealings of God, and he began to, deal with me and show me things, and stuff began to rise to the surface. And I didn't quite understand why I was feeling the way that I was feeling. And so what that looks like on the ground, being self-aware of yourself, is being honest and saying I said to myself, why did I keep making the bad decisions that I was making? What made me make those decisions? Why did I keep doing it over and over again? And while I was making those decisions, why did I feel the way that I felt? Right? Those were the questions that I began to ask myself. Being brutally honest, being brutally transparent. Right? Brutally honest with yourself. And so, as I was going through this self-awareness, I began to uproot some things, right? Some things that had happened in my life when I was a young child. I never said the word out, I never said it out loud. I told it to somebody who I trusted, at the time, the person that I was engaged to, I told him what happened, but I didn't fully understand the effects that it had on me. And so at the age of 8 or 9 years old, I was raped. And I didn't quite understand what was going on because 8 or 9 years old, I mean that we're talking about probably 1975. Back then they didn't talk about those things, right? Those things that happen in your house, that cliche, what happens in this house stays in this house, right? That was a cliche that was used, in our African American community, right? And so I was raped at the age of 8 years old, and I did not understand or didn't know the effects that would have on me, on my life, on my soul. And so as I was going through this process of self-awareness, I began to discover the effects that the rape had on me as a child, because I didn't have the language to speak what was happening to me. And as I got older, I didn't understand that the roots of that was affecting my soul, right? I didn't understand that the roots of that was affecting and brought on the insecurities, that brought on the low self-esteem, that brought on the fear, right? All of that came from the trauma that I experienced in my life, right? And so as I began to become self-aware and I began to understand and study and research the effects that rape have on children, I began to see myself in those effects. I began to see why I was insecure. I began to see why when I was in a room, I spotted a place that I can go sit in the background and be seen and not heard, right? Because as children, we were taught, to be seen and not heard, right? So with that thought of being seen and not heard, on top of the trauma and the effect that it had on my soul, I began to understand why. I began to understand why I had no value, right? Vacant esteem, right? I began to understand all of the effects that trauma had on my soul. I began to understand why I made the bad decisions that I made. I began to understand why those decisions were me living out my reality of those decisions, right? Because the decisions that you make at a certain time in your life become your reality that you live out in the future, right? So I had no understanding of those things until I became self-aware. And in the process of me becoming self-aware, I began to understand why I was like I was. But at the same time, I was still praying that prayer, God, I want to be in your will. And as I begin to cry out to God, right? God, I don't want to be like this. I don't want to feel this way anymore. I don't like this. I don't like that I'm this way. As I begin to cry out to God to ask him to help me, he began to show me who I am in him, right? He began to show me the plans that he had for me from the very foundation of the world. And as I began to walk out my healing, right, I discovered that I was responsible for my own soul, right? And in that discovery, I found out that I was responsible for stewarding my soul, right? Because me having a soul is a confirmation of me being in the image of likeness of God, right? In Genesis 127, it said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. And being in the image and likeness of God means that we have a soul. And our soul is that invisible part of us that allows us to think, that allows us to have a mind. It allows us to have emotions. And it allows us to have a free will to make the decisions and choices that we make in our lives. And in my self-awareness journey, that's why I discovered what my soul was. That's why I discovered that I am a steward of my own soul. Right? So soul care is more important than self-care. Right? Because when you care for your soul, then that self-care will come automatically. Right? When you care for your soul and when you care for what you allow in your soul through your eyes, because they say that the eyes are the window to the soul. Right? When you listen to certain things, you're allowing that in your soul. Right? When you think about certain things, you're allowing that into your soul. Right? So when you're watching something on television or you're watching a video, you're allowing that into your spirit. Right? You're allowing that into your soul. And when you allow that into your soul, then you begin to think about what you saw. Right? And when you begin to think about what you saw, then you begin to have those words. You begin to speak those words about what you saw. Right? And when you begin to speak those words about what you saw, then you begin to have emotions and feelings about that. And before you know it, you're acting out what you seen or what you allowed in your soul, what you allowed in your spirit. And it's very imperative that you steward your soul, right? Because this body that I have, this body that you have, this body is going to obey exactly what's on the inside of your soul. Don't believe me? Try to do something without thinking about it. I'm not talking about your everyday mundane things that you're on autopilot, right? When you wake up in the morning, you don't have to think about getting up, making your bed. You don't have to think about, taking a shower, washing your face and brushing your teeth. You may have to put a little bit of thought into what you're going to wear for the day, but you don't have to think about it, right? Wake up in the morning. You don't think about those things. You're on autopilot because you've done it so many times that you automatically know how to do it without thinking about it, right? How you navigate to work, the path, the way that you take to work, the directions that you go to work. You don't think about those things because you've done it so many times. It's on autopilot, right? Those things are fine and perfect. But think about those decisions that you made. Think about the root of it. What is the root of that decision that you made? And that's part of stewarding your soul. Right? Thinking about all those moments and all those decisions and all of those emotions and every action that you've done, right? The behaviors, the way that you've acted, right? The way that you've lived your life, the choices that you made, right? All of that lives in your soul, which is why it's so imperative, right? To steward your soul. It is your responsibility to steward your soul. Right? Because nobody else will. Right? So it's so imperative that we become good stewards of our souls. It's so imperative that we sit with ourselves and become aware of who we are. Right? Have you ever just sat down for 2 minutes without saying anything, without thinking about anything, without talking to anybody, just sit silently? And you notice when you sit in that silence, you have so many thoughts running through your mind. And if you think about it, if you think about those thoughts or catch yourself, there is a path. It's like breadcrumbs to where those thoughts come from, especially the ruminating ones, right? Especially the ones that continue to come back over and over and over and over again. There's a beginning to those thoughts. There's a beginning to those emotions. There's a beginning to that behavior. And in stewarding your soul, it is your responsibility to discover the beginning, the root of that. And I can tell you, in that moment of sacredness, when you become fully self-aware of who you are and your ability to identify why you think the way you think, why you feel the way you feel, and why you behave the way you behave. There is a freedom in that. There is a freedom in stewarding your soul because you realize I'm responsible for what enters into my soul. I'm responsible for that. So no, I'm not going to watch that. No, I'm not going to listen to that. No, I'm not going to go there because that's not who I am. And I don't, it's too much work to get to where I am to maintain this freedom. So when you steward your soul, right, you begin to value yourself differently. You begin to look at yourself differently, right? Because you understand the path, you understand the work that it took to get to where you are. You understand and you value who you are more. You value the thoughts and the things that you allow into your soul, into your spirit. So that's how you steward your soul, right? The foundation of stewarding your soul is becoming self-aware. And becoming self-aware is a sacredness. It's sacred, right? Because you're living in truth. And when you're living in truth, then that's the beginning of freedom, right? Being free is an exhilarating feeling of, I know that I'm dependent on God, but also I know I'm responsible for myself. I'm responsible for what I allow to affect me. I'm responsible for what I allow in my ears, what I hear, what I see, what I say. And so you value yourself more. Your esteem grows, right? Your esteem becomes greater and larger, and you begin to love yourself in a way that is unexplainable, right? You begin to look at yourself differently and say, oh, I'm expensive because freedom is expensive, but it's worth it, right? And so I encourage you today to begin to steward your soul, right? Just as much as you self-care, care for your soul. Invest in your soul. Invest in you. Take some time every day. Get your journal. Journal your thoughts. Ask yourself, why did I make this decision today? Ask yourself, why did I decide to give this person my telephone number? Right? Ask yourself those questions. Because if you are brutally honest with yourself, if you're transparent with yourself, if you become fully self-aware, then you're living in a sacred time. You're living in sacred moments. And living in sacred moments, it's a freedom that you can't explain. And so I hope that I've said something today that will help you on your journey to stewarding your soul. I hope that I said something today that will start you on your journey to soul care, to caring for your soul. Because again, that is the part of you that will live in eternity. If nobody has ever told you that, that is the part of you that will live in eternity. You have body, you have soul, in spirit. And they all make you who you are today. So care for your soul. Trust me, you won't regret it. Trust me, it'll be the best decision that you've ever made in your life. And until next time, this has been Soul Dialogue, where every conversation leads to transformation. Bye.